Now, here comes to the most important part. I need to introduce our guest of honor. The speaker is Professor Camilo Perez-Bustillo. Right, he says right. Give me applause. And Professor Camilo is a visiting professor of human rights and social justice at this university, National Taiwan University. And he's also affiliated researcher of the Global Research Program on Inequality, GRIP. You can look up the information on the website, at the University of Bergen in Norway. He's also a former fellow at CASBS Stanford University and the former director of research and advocacy at Hope Border Institute in Texas, El Paso. He's also the lead author of the book, Human Rights, Hegemony and Utopia in Latin America. The subtitle is Poverty, Forced Migration, and Resistance in Mexico and Colombia. It's published in 2016. And he's also the co-founder of the International Tribunal of Conscience of Peoples in Movement and of Witness at the Border. He earned his JD, that's a doctoral degree of law school, from Northwestern University in the year of, I don't tell you when. Now he's a professor invited by our Department of Psychology, Law School, and also Gaoyan Yuan. He's gonna give us this lecture on the decolonizing human rights, trauma, cultural identity, and resistance among migrants of indigenous origin at the U.S.-Mexico border. As what I was joking with Camilo, that the stories happening in the U.S. and Mexico border was the story or the joke of the century nowadays. So let's hear from Camilo.
Thank you. I'm honored to be with all of you. I want to thank, first of all, the people of Taiwan who've made their friendship and hospitality a permanent feature of my stay here. This has been my first experience in Taiwan since last September. I had the honor to begin with that semester. And I just can't say enough about everything I have learned from you, my students, and from being here in this space. Specifically, my appreciation to Dean Liao, to the Institute for receiving me most recently as a visiting scholar, but who first brought me, I don't know if she's here yet, Professor Ye from the psychology department. I think maybe she hasn't been able to arrive yet, but she will be coming. But just so you know, even before she comes, he's been my host through the psychology department and through another colleague named Professor I Ching. And I want to thank the psychology department for housing me and the College of Law. I don't think any of the professors are here, but my students from the College of Law are here. So I want to thank my students for coming, and of course, the Department of Social Work for welcoming me this afternoon, for the professors that are present, and for your words, very kind words. So thank you for making the space, and the students of social work. So again, all I have is appreciation and gratitude. And what I want to try to share with you is how I've begun to look at the issues that I've been working on for about 30 years in various different modes regarding the question of the status of migrants, refugees, and displaced persons in the US, but specifically at the context of the US-Mexico border and Mexico's southern border. So the way I've tried to sort of shorten that from the original title is we're talking about Mexico's borders, both north and south, which begins the process, which I think is key, of looking at these issues, let's say, from the south, from the global south. So no longer referencing it as the border of the US, but these are the borders of Mexico. but they have a north and they have a south. And this might be familiar to many of you who know something about decolonial thinking, which is a key inspiration for what I want to share with you. So we'll situate ourselves at the border. Thank you so much for my assistance from the Institute. The framework overall, essentially what I want us to have a conversation about, because I don't want to just speak, I want to hear from you and I want to dialogue with you. And I want today to be the beginning of a dialogue with you. What I want us to think about is, what does it mean to look at human rights from a decolonial perspective? That's the key guiding thread. I mean, the way I want to apply that and ground that is in the context of migrants, as I mentioned, but more specifically, and really what I want to talk about the most, is migrants who bring together two key conditions of exclusion, which are experienced at the border, whether it be Mexico's northern border or the southern border, which are migrants of indigenous origin. So we have a convergence between two key sectors. We can zoom out and think about those key sectors on a global scale. We can talk about it on a regional scale in terms of the Western Hemisphere. I want us to zoom in a little bit and think about it in the contexts I have mentioned. But I want us to think, in decolonial thinking, we talk about the interstices, the interstitial spaces, the spaces in between, the layers of these different kinds of grounding that I'm sharing with you. So yes, these are migrants, but they are also migrants specifically of indigenous origin. And both conditions are crucial to lead us eventually to this decolonial framework. So that's when I talk about decolonizing human rights, that's the idea. We can move on to the next one. Thank you. This is more about the decolonial framing. Essentially what we're talking about here, and this is what I've been sharing with my students at the College of Law in the course they're currently engaged in with me, and hopefully this won't be repetition for them, but kind of a way of emphasizing some points. Essentially, the argument is the following. If we want to understand these issues as to the human rights of migrants at the border, what we have to understand is the colonial origin of international law and of human rights itself. That's why the task is to decolonize human rights. Just as in a sense, there was an attempt to decolonize Christianity through the figure of the Virgin of Guadalupe, yes? There's kind of an analogy here to what we're seeking to do in human rights. Now, to what extent that task is possible and what the difficulties are in undertaking that task, that's the open question. But my suggestion here, my hypothesis, is that it is the social movements of migrants of indigenous origin who illustrate best, epitomize that conjuncture and that challenge and what the response might be. That's essentially the framework. So here you've seen some of the allusions to some of the great theoretical sources in decolonial thinking in Latin America. Decolonial thinking is very much a Latin American school of thought that has become global, which of course is exactly the opposite of the traditional framework of diffusion of epistemologies in the world, normally from the West. In this case, or from the global North. In this case, this is theoretical thinking grounded in concrete social movements and conditions in the global South, in this case in Latin America, which is illuminating thinking in the global North and in the West. Yeah? So it's a reversal, and that's a very important element of this. This is all about understanding the centrality of the issues of racial and cultural difference and its construction in forms of domination that have historically evolved and situating issues as to migration, issues as to the border, issues as to indigenous migrants, issues as to what might the difference be or not between Trump and Biden. What are the continuities of a structural character that cut across all of those dimensions? And how do we cut across that? We use the edge of critical thinking that a decolonial perspective provides. But we apply it to this context. This also draws heavily for inspiration. Those of you who may be familiar with sort of the itinerary, let's say, of cultural studies, Stuart Hall is an absolutely indispensable influence in terms of the way I'm approaching these issues, the way he framed issues of racial and cultural difference from the perspective of the diasporas, the dispersion of colonized peoples from the Caribbean, like Stuart Hall himself, who came to London, first to Birmingham, to found what became known as the new discipline of cultural studies. Once again, the thinking and the experience coming from the global south and illuminating the global north, the reverse of the traditional trajectory. Aníbal Quijano is specifically from Peru, one of the great theoretical masters of this kind of thinking in a Latin American context. So that just as, for example, Stuart Hall looked at it from the perspective of the Caribbean diaspora to the UK in a colonial framework, Aníbal Quijano looked at it from the perspective of what happened to indigenous peoples and people of African descent in the Latin American context, and more specifically in Peru and in the Andean region. So eventually all of this will take us to migrants, indigenous, at the border, but this is the framing. The key thing is that the origin of all of this, the origin of that management epistemologically of the issue of racial and cultural difference, the issue of the very relationship between the colonial powers and the colonized, at the same time as the Portuguese ships were seeing the island that they called Formosa in the distance, and the Spanish were landing here at Keelung, and the Dutch, right? At that same historical moment, that process was going on globally, which is why decolonial thinking has that global reach. So the issue is, at that moment, we have not just the origin of what comes to be known as racism, the management in that fashion of racial and cultural difference as a form of domination, colonial, imperial, and now neocolonial as we speak today. What is the US relationship with the countries of Central America from which these migrants come? It's a neocolonial relationship. Just as previously their relationship with Spain was colonial. So the continuity is colonial. That's what Quijano defines as the, quote, colonial matrix of power. This is what we refer to in Latin America as the system of 500 years. Let's think back just for a moment to make this connected directly to Taiwan, because I've been struck by this history. When I hear about the Portuguese ships seeing the shores of what they called Ilha Formosa, beautiful island, right? When I hear about the Spanish establishing their settlement of San Salvador, and then eventually being displaced by the Dutch, and then eventually displaced by the Ming, and then by the Jing dynasty, and so on, what I hear is a history of colonial succession, just as we have experienced in Latin America. And what I think back to is, at that moment in the 16th century, when the Portuguese were seeing the beautiful outline of the island in the distance, and when the Spanish were beginning to establish a framework of settler colonialism here, as the British did later of course, in Australia and in New Zealand, or the Dutch in Indonesia, or the French in Southeast Asia, and all of the European powers at the peripheries of China, the period of unequal treaties, what we see is the same patterns. The same patterns. Of course, the specificities vary, but the core patterns are the same. And that's the key point of departure. This is the origin not just of racism as a central phenomenon of modernity, an essential element of modernity, but also of what is called coloniality. La colonialidad. The term originally comes in Spanish, la colonialidad. And so this is what Noam Chomsky and Emanuel Wallerstein, through the contributions of what's called world systems theory, have called the system of 500 years. And I suspect my hypothesis would be that that system persists in Latin America as it does in East Asia and implicates not just my family in Mexico and in Colombia, but your families in Taiwan and in East Asia. That's one of the bridges between us. This, I think, is something that Walter Benjamin reminds us of as well, who is, I think, obviously before Stuart Hall, one of the great originators of what became known as cultural studies. It wasn't called cultural studies in his time, it was called philosophy, right? And it was at the edges of the Frankfurt School and critical theory, and we have to situate Walter Benjamin at his moment. But what's extraordinary is how prescient his thinking was. Two key elements. This idea, and this is very much what I think is this reflection about the persistence of coloniality, the persistence of this system globally of imposed racial and cultural difference. What Benjamin reminded us of is every document of that civilization, of that modernity that he was writing about in 1939 and 1940, right, as the world was exploding around him, was every document of civilization is at the same time a document of barbarity. So when we study our international law textbooks, in fact, what we are studying is documents of barbarity, right? They do not, of course, assume themselves as such. That's our task as critical scholars and thinkers, and I would argue as critical lawyers. I continue to be a lawyer in terms of how I look at these issues. But our first task is the task of critique. And then based on that critique, transformation. So Benjamin is present. And then the other thing that he said is, let's think about history from a different place. Just as I was suggesting, let's talk about Mexico's borders, not the US's borders. Let's look at it from the south, right? This is what Boaventura Sousa Santos, another great contributor to this kind of thinking, globally describes as the epistemologies of the South, the epistemologies of the global South. What Benjamin said is, let's think about history from a different place. Let's think about history from the perspective of what he described as the traditions of the oppressed. The traditions of the oppressed. Those excluded, dominated, exploited by the colonial and neo-colonial, the imperial management, eventually the capitalist and neoliberal capitalist management of racial and cultural difference. And let's think about history from there. And so what he reminds us in his theses on the philosophy of history, written on the eve of his death, as he fled the dispossession of his citizenship because he was Jewish, right, by Nazi Germany, as he died at the border between Spain and France, denied an exit visa from France and denied an entry visa to Spain by fascist Spain, speaking about migrants, speaking about the displaced. Walter Benjamin was himself one of them. He said, the traditions of the oppressed teach us that the state of the emergency in which we live is not the exception, but the rule. Permanent states of emergency. So what is the condition that characterizes the status of migrants throughout the world today? It is that condition of living in a permanent state of emergency. The assumption is always that migrants somehow, that it's legitimate to treat them as less than full human beings. And indigenous migrants even more so, because so many indigenous peoples are not even fully recognized as citizens within their own countries, much less the countries to which they migrate. So this is where those two conditions of exclusion come together. So we are seeking today to speak from that place of exclusion, which is a global space, but which has a specific configuration at the U.S.-Mexico border. We continue, that's the system of 500 years. So we're talking about global migration, indigenous peoples, human rights from below. We're emphasizing three different kinds of violence. That's the kind of exclusion that I'm alluding to. This is the school of structural violence that was developed by Johannes Galtung, which many of you may be familiar with, and which has been developed more recently in the context of critical development studies by Goran Therborn in his work on inequality on a global scale. So let's connect Therborn and Galtung, and let's talk about three different dimensions of violence. These are the dimensions of violence we have to be engaged with as critical advocates for excluded groups, whether it be as lawyers, as social workers, as psychologists, whatever our discipline might be. All of those disciplines that are represented today. Three forms of violence: structural violence, state violence, which is the traditional violence that human rights is normally about. When we teach human rights and practice human rights, it's violence inflicted by state actors, in effect, or in connivance, in complicity with state actors, right? And that's a whole class in itself, right? State violence, and it's ultimately what's called, genocide or crimes against humanity, etc. You know, the major crimes of human rights, genocide especially. But it's also systemic violence. What I refer to as systemic violence is that it's not enough for us to be concerned about structural violence, poverty, inequality, discrimination, various forms of domination, patriarchal power, etc., gender violence, all those different dimensions, violence on the basis of sexual identity, gender preference, on and on. We can flesh that out. But we also have to be concerned about violence which is inherent, embedded in the capitalist mode of production itself. We might like capitalism, we might not. But if we are to be honest, what we must recognize is that that kind of violence is inherent in capitalism itself, right? And so I think that's the point of departure as well, because that is the explanation for why people migrate and who migrates. That's the structural framework. That's the context within which we come to trauma. What brought me to the psychology department, thanks to Professor Ye, who has arrived, and I want to welcome her and acknowledge her again. I had already spoken about the fact that you brought me here, and my gratitude for that. But the issue of trauma came because one of the very creative ideas of Professor Ye was, okay, let's find a way to connect the work you've done on human rights with work related to psychology as a discipline. And the bridge, thanks to Professor Ye and Professor Yi Ching, my colleague that I've been teaching with, is to think about trauma from an interdisciplinary perspective. So what psychologists call trauma is what we call the effects, the evidence of serious human rights violations. Yes? And the conditions they produce among the victims of human rights violations. So it's speaking from the victims just as we're speaking from the global South. And that's another very important element of all of this. Decolonial thinking is not just geographic about the global South. It's about speaking from the victims, historically, of systems of domination. Whatever label those systems may have, colonial, neo-colonial, imperial, capitalist, whatever. The issue is, what is the harm done to human beings as a result? And it's what Upendra Bakshi, the great jurist from India, has defined as the centrality of human suffering. That's what trauma is when we use the term trauma. So we're talking about how U.S. migration policies carried out independently of which administration is in office. For our purposes, there is not sufficient difference between what Trump did and what Biden is currently doing, and we can talk more about that. The net result is harm, human suffering, and trauma. And that's why we need to work together with psychologists, with social workers, with others in the helping professions to repair the damage done. Because one of the fundamental principles that many of you will be familiar with who study law is for every injury, there must be a remedy. For every right, there must be a remedy. And there is this global framework that I'll allude to along the way, which is the framework of transitional justice, which of course is an unfolding process in Taiwan as we speak. And so I've become a student of the process of transitional justice in Taiwan because I would argue it's potentially one of the most important processes in the world, potentially. Right? And we can try and place it in a comparative framework and talk about that more. But one of the things that creates affinity for me between my work in Latin America and my work in Taiwan, just as I mentioned the affinity in our histories, our colonial histories, yeah, and neocolonial experiences, it's also the affinity around issues of transitional justice. But what I'm seeking to add to that mix is the right to transitional justice for indigenous migrants who are the victims of those three forms of violence. Yeah? So that's how we make the connection. What does transitional justice mean? It can mean a truth commission. In Taiwan, there is not yet a truth commission, but there is a transitional justice commission, which many think may be a step towards a truth commission, maybe not, but there's a question about that. But the other dimension is normally prosecutions for human rights violations. As we know, there have been no such prosecutions in Taiwan thus far. What there's been is a system of compensation or exoneration for the victims of crimes during the White Terror and during martial law. And perhaps 228, more kind of indirectly, but not human rights prosecutions. In any case, transitional justice is about right. It's essentially about 4 or 5 dimensions. It's the right to truth, to historical memory, to justice, to reparations, which are both individual and collective, and are both material and symbolic. This is where, for example, the contribution of psychology and of social work comes in, right? Because, for example, someone suffers trauma, what are they entitled to in terms of services, socio-psychological support to address those harms, right? For example, the migrants of indigenous origin who have had family members die in US custody because their medical needs were ignored and neglected. Children aged 6, 7, 8 years old, 6 children of indigenous origin, migrant children, died in US custody. The US who preaches human rights to the rest of the world, right? In US custody in 2018 and 2019. But today, as we speak, there are 20,000 migrant children, primarily of indigenous origin, primarily from Guatemala, who are in exactly the same conditions of overcrowding and medical neglect and neglect of their social and psychological needs for support and services at Mexico's northern border and in the US, who are in danger also of dying. But in any case, subjected to irreversible, irreparable trauma. We've worked closely with psychologists and social workers in the US who've gone. I have visited with them those places of detention. I visited them personally a year and a half ago when the situation was at a previous high. Now it's surpassing that. And I saw and participated with them in the interviews with the children, most of them Guatemalan, most of them indigenous, who spoke of their pain and spoke of their suffering. To this day, there has been no redress and no reparation for their injuries. As a lawyer, I say they are entitled to compensation, they are entitled to reparations, they are entitled to human rights from below, in effect. We can continue then. We're talking about this overall integral approach to the issue of what's called human mobility. So it's not just migrants narrowly defined, which traditionally are defined in migration studies as those who migrate for economic motivations, right? What are referred to as economic migrants. Let's say the domestic migrant workers in Taiwan, from Indonesia and the Philippines, for example, or elsewhere in the region. But it's also those who cut across those categories, migrants, refugees, the displaced, and indigenous peoples within that framework. So we refer to them as peoples in movement, pueblos en movimiento. Because what we're talking about, and this is something very important in terms of the rupture, the break with colonial ways of thinking and neo-colonial ways of thinking about law and thinking about rights and thinking about human rights, we're talking about these migrants of indigenous origin as collective, transnational subjects of rights. There are two major errors in colonial and neocolonial thinking about law. One, that we're talking about individuals, and two, that we're talking about people within a national framework. We seek to break with both of those. We're talking about collective subjects with collective rights. For example, the collective right to self-determination, right? For example, the right that many would argue in Taiwan has been denied as a political community. That's an open question, of course, but it's a way to frame the reality here. The question is, every national community in the world, indigenous or not, has the right to self-determination under international law. The only question is, are some more equal than others? Are some looked at as cases that are preferential because of colonial, neo-colonial, and other forms of thinking rooted in domination and in exploitation? So we're talking about, for indigenous peoples, migration as an ancestral right. It's not something, indigenous people do not have to ask any state for permission to move. Number one, it's the states that have to ask them for permission because they are the ones who've been invaded. It's the states who've been the invaders, and it's indigenous peoples who have been the invaded, in Taiwan as elsewhere. No? I mean, this is simply a global, reproduced phenomenon. And so that means we have to recognize that for indigenous peoples, the right to migrate is essential, but it's a right that has to be qualified by the recognition that much current migration among indigenous peoples is not voluntary, it's imposed. It's imposed by structural conditions of violence over which they have no control. No? Amartya Sen, the great Bengali economist, Nobel Prize economist, one time was asked in his book, Development as Freedom, 1998, he was asked, he wrote about this, he was asked, how do you define poverty? He defined poverty the following way, which I think is directly applicable to what I was just talking about. What he said is, poverty is the lack of control over the circumstances in which you live. Poverty is the lack of control over the circumstances in which you live. He's saying that as an economist from India, from Bengal, specifically. I would read that as a lawyer, and I would say the following. He's talking about an individual and collective right to self-determination. We have to translate it into our discipline and the way our discipline thinks about these issues. So when he says poverty is the lack of control over the circumstances in which you live, he's talking about individuals and groups denied their right to self-determination. No? And that includes the right to migrate or not to migrate. Because every right has a negative dimension and a positive dimension. Freedom of speech cannot mean that you are compelled to speak. You can be silent, and that's an exercise of freedom of speech. Right? The more classic version is you're censored because of something you said or wrote. But you could also be compelled to speak and declare loyalty to something you don't believe in. I mean, we have too many nearby experiences along those lines, no? And recent experiences here with martial law, et cetera, oaths of loyalty, et cetera. And, the kind of spying that went on, for example, in universities in Taiwan. At NTU, the kind of crimes that were committed, sadly, even here at the grounds of NTU during the martial law period. So we have to understand that rights work both ways, and that the right to migrate necessarily includes the right not to migrate and not to be displaced. And so indigenous movements in Latin America define this through their agency, through their imagination, their decolonial imagination as the right to stay. The right to stay. El derecho de permanecer. The right to remain. But it also means when circumstances oblige you to be able to move and not to have to ask any state for permission, much less the colonial and neo-colonial states that dispossess them and that are responsible for the structural violence and hunger in which they live. This means that migration itself has to be understood. This is what Tendai Achiume from Zambia, an African scholar based at UCLA Law School in the US. Again, the knowledge coming from the south to the north. So what's interesting, it's not brain drain, it's something more profound. She is now the UN's special point person, it's called rapporteur, for issues of racism and racial discrimination. She writes in an article at Stanford University Law Review 2 years ago, she writes that we have to understand migration essentially as a form of decolonization. So when I'm suggesting we need to look at indigenous migrants from a decolonial perspective, she's saying as a legal scholar, we have to think of migration itself as a process of decolonization. So that situates us also. And then, of course, we have everything related to the concept of settler colonialism, which we can't unpack here, but I think many of you are familiar with. And there's a lot of legal work going around about the implications of settler colonialism, the legal implications, but also the concept of racial capitalism. In other words, if you want to understand the Black Lives Matter movement today in the US and globally, if you want a theoretical framework, look at the theoretical framework of racial capitalism and the work, for example, of Ruth Wilson Gilmore and the work of Cedric Robinson and the work of C.L.R. James and the work of Stuart Hall and many other diaspora intellectuals in the UK who have traversed that journey. Let's continue. Thank you. So, migration as structural justice, as structural violence and transitional justice. We can continue forward after that. All of this is based on a combination that in Latin America is known as participatory action research. The school of Orlando Falls Borda from Colombia, who is the developer of that concept of participatory action research. He was originally a sociologist, trained in the US at the University of Florida. The name is Orlando Falls Borda. And so that is a qualitative approach based on field work that I've been engaged in at both Mexico's northern border and southern border throughout the last decade. So that's essentially what I'm trying to ground a lot of this in. It's comparative, it's critical, it's interdisciplinary, it's intercultural, it's intersectional. Think of Kimberly Crenshaw, think of Patricia Hill Collins, think of other great innovators in the field of intersectional thinking, which is in a sense the US version of decolonial thinking applied to racial capitalism in the US and the violence associated with it, and then decolonial thinking. When you think about the border, do not ever think about the border without the work of Gloria Anzaldúa. Gloria Anzaldúa, who wrote this extraordinary book, an absolute classic in the field of critical cultural studies and what was later called decolonial studies. The term did not exist at the time she wrote it, called Borderlands, La Frontera. She was both a poet and a philosopher. And Gloria Anzaldúa was a Chicana queer feminist who wrote about these issues from those perspectives. She's essentially the founder, among others, along with Cherry Moraga, of what's known as Chicana queer feminist theory. And it was clearly in the decolonial mode, in the intersectional mode. Again, those terms didn't exist at that moment. And what she wrote about always was the border, quote, as an open wound. La frontera es una herida abierta. The border is an open wound. Why? We were talking about this informally with the kind professor who's hosting me, Professor Fung, which is about when you hear the rhetoric about the surge of migrants at the US's southern border right now as we speak. What you hear is this fear that's framed as the fear of a, quote, Hispanic invasion. I have to mention, I've never met a Hispanic. I don't know what a Hispanic is, except it's a census category. It's not a person and it's not a community. I'm a Latino or Latina if I was a woman. So that's a whole other discussion. We can talk about that terminology. But they're referring to us, my people, my family. But the key thing is they talk about an invasion of the US. And it's especially ironic for anybody to say that about the US's southern border, because the US's southern border was constructed historically through the US's invasion of Mexico. The reason all of the states that are at the periphery of the US's southern border, Mexico's northern border, have Spanish names, Colorado, Arizona, California, of course you've always heard them mispronounced, Texas, Nuevo Mexico, etc., right? You might recognize some of these. Nevada, Las Vegas, right? Why do they have Spanish names? Because they belong to Mexico, and before that, to the Spanish colonial empire. And believe me, I'm not saying the Spanish colonial empire was better than the British. In fact, in many ways, worse. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is it's a different history. No? And so to say that it's migrants who are invading the US, when it's the US, by invading the home countries of migrants, that produces the conditions that drive current migration, is worse than cynical. Worse. And it's at the heart, of course, of Trump and his rhetoric, but it remains, in terms of structural continuity, in Biden's policies today. Because Biden's emphasis today, he said it personally in his interview on ABC News with George Stephanopoulos 2 weeks ago on the Sunday program called This Week. You can find it on YouTube. I think maybe I have a clip later. We won't get to it, but it's there. I'll send you all the presentation. You'll have the links. What Biden said is, don't come. Don't come. Yeah? Bottom, so remember, give me your tired, your poor, your oppressed masses yearning to breathe free, what's said at the base of the Statue of Liberty, the poem of Emma Lazarus, right? And now what the statue says, let's erasure, let's wipe it clean and say, don't come, don't come. Angela Merkel in Germany, who's not a hero of mine either, right? But let's compare Angela Merkel and Joe Biden. In the summer of 2015, admitted 2 million people from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq in one summer. And Joe Biden's upset because there were 70,000 at the US border in February. 70,000 versus 2 million. So who's the leader of the free world today? Just a question. No. So when they say that we are the invaders, perhaps we have to rethink that from a more critical perspective, historically. So this is the border as method, and this is also what Akile Mbembe, originally of Cameroon, now based in South Africa, one of the great contemporary decolonial thinkers, Akile Mbembe calls necropolitics, and what Foucault called biopower and biopolitics. Let's move on. I know time is running out. Time is our enemy. Let's look at some maps quickly. This is the region we're talking about. This is where most of the migration is coming from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. That's the so-called Northern Triangle. So we're kind of situated there. It's primarily migration from Central America and from the Caribbean, but it's also global. It's also Africans, and it's also Asians. So we can come back to that in the discussion. Let's look at the next. These are the traditional routes up until around 2016. Again, we can talk about this in more detail. I know we're going to run out of time, so I don't want to take up time. But just have this map in mind, and you will have the presentations. These are the various routes. That's what these points indicate, both land routes and maritime routes. This is how migrants get there. And of course, why do migrants take these routes? Why do migrants try to go to the US this way? Because there's no way to go legally. There is no way to get what's called a green card, a visa, to enter the US legally if you are a poor working class person from Central America, much less if you're indigenous. It is simply impossible. You will never get a visa, right? I mean, you will be turned away even before you hand in the application. It's not even worth the effort to apply. No? It's even difficult if you're middle class. Essentially, you can only get a visa because, of course, the US feels that it's saturated. There are too many Latinos, Latinas. But let's ask the Germans about that, right? And also, we have 60 million people of Latin origin in the US. 80% of the people who migrate have family members already living in the US, which is very important that we remember when we talk about what happens to unaccompanied migrants and the status of migrant children. Let's look at the next map. The routes have begun to change and to become consolidated. You can just imagine the difference of the previous map and this one. So the routes have become consolidated because it's become so dangerous to travel through Mexico. Why? Because the governing policy of the US, which continues under Biden, is called prevention through deterrence. This is a policy that was established by the Border Patrol's strategic plan in 1994. You can find it on the web, and I think the link is in my presentation, or I'll add it. Prevention through deterrence. Don't come. Don't come. But not only that, just like the EU does with Turkey and with Libya and with Morocco, it's to find ways for the countries at the periphery to do the dirty work, as Australia did with Manus Island and with Nauru and with Indonesia. Right? I mean, we know, of course, the scandal of Australian migration policy represented by Manus Island and by Nauru. No, I mentioned that for my Australian colleagues so that we can dialogue about that. It's been an outrage globally. And of course, Australia was always defined. It's the classic settler colonialist country, even more perhaps than the US or Canada, which is pretty bad, or South Africa before, during the period of apartheid. It's a country built on white hegemony, specifically. And its migration policy always reflected that. And so the fear was Australia might become Asian, just like the US might become Latin American. Well, history has a way of turning things around. No? Let's continue the next map. This is the route of what are called the migrant caravans. The response to the travel becoming so dangerous is migrants organize basically self-defense and travel together. These are known as the migrant caravans. This is self-determination. These are primarily indigenous migrants from Central America in particular who have very strong community ties, so they travel as communities, not just as extended families, but as communities. And not just as families and communities, but as collective subjects of transnational rights who affirm the right to migrate. The right to migrate as a fundamental human right. That's the fundamental demand. Let's move on. And of course, we'll see how these caravans were repressed shortly. This is just so you have a sense of the distribution and concentration of indigenous peoples in Latin America. There's a lot of complexities we don't need to go into right now about how you define who is indigenous and how does the census do that and what should the methodology be and what about the issue of self-identification. And you can imagine all of the methodological complexities and the epistemological complexities about defining identity and doing that through state action. But the bottom line is we have some numbers. Now the numbers vary. For example, in this chart, it mentions Guatemala being 41% indigenous. It's still very high, but there's another chart that I'll show you next that says Guatemala is 55% indigenous. And it isn't that there was a big growth between one study and another. It's simply the studies were done under different methodology. No, so we have an issue. Let's put it this way. Minimum 41%, maximum 55%, right? Whatever, the point is very high percentage. Today, as we speak, most of the migrant children that I described being held in conditions that are inherently unsafe and never intended to hold children, and denied caseworkers, by the way, they need social workers there, denied access to psychologists, denied access to support services, denied access to sponsors by the Biden administration. As we speak, most of those are indigenous from Guatemala. I visited them in those detention centers, the Tornillo Detention Center at the periphery of El Paso. So I mean, I'm speaking of who I met and saw, but also I'm saying of the data that we have. Where do they come from? We'll look at that in a moment. Let's look at the next chart. This is the indigenous territories of Central America. So in addition to the percentages, you can get the idea, the darker areas are where the concentration is of indigenous population. And then the question would be, where is the migration coming? Primarily from those darker spaces. Then, of course, the question is why, right? And where does state violence, structural violence, systemic violence, US policies, US intervention, et cetera, come in? Where does the history, that colonial and neocolonial history, come in? We'll get to that in a moment. These are the names of the different indigenous groups. Yeah, then I'm sorry, we can come back to that, sorry. This is another chart that, again, shows a different percentage, just so you get a sense of the flux in the figures. I'm sorry, if we continue. This is just the overlap for those of you interested in issues, at the horizon of international law, at the horizon of human rights as we speak, is the issue of environmental devastation, ecocide, and climate change, right? What's sort of, I would say, euphemistically referred to as climate change, right? Because I think ultimately it's really ecocide. It's really environmental devastation. But concretely, it's the dispossession of indigenous peoples in strategic regions that are natural reserves. And there's a very high correlation, not just between being indigenous and being a migrant, but being an indigenous person and living in a region which is the object of strategic contestation in terms of control by transnational corporations, primarily from the US, who are predatory and destroying the environment as we speak, making it impossible to live there in a sustainable way. So if we ask why people migrate, that's why people migrate. This overlap. No? Let's move on to the next. This is the regions of Guatemala I wanted to highlight that I visited doing field work in January of 2019, which are the regions of origin of 2 of the migrant children. I mentioned about the migrant indigenous children who died in custody under Trump in 2018 and 2019. 2 of them died in December 2018 in El Paso, Texas, where I was working, defending migrants. And sadly, we were not able to save them. They were held in unsafe conditions. This is pre-pandemic. They died of the flu. Might have ended up being coronavirus. We don't know, right? It's too late now to know. But it was before coronavirus. The pandemic had been identified. But they died of the flu, aged 7 and 8 years old. Jacqueline Calmaquin, who was from this region of Rash Ruja, in the region of Alta Verapaz, on the edge of the Petén jungle. If you know the Tikal Mayan indigenous site, one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world, that's in Petén. That's what's traditionally known as a rainforest. They've been afflicted by a devastating drought the last 7 years. Rainforest is normally temperate and high rain. They haven't had rain in 7 years. So when we went to visit the families, to stand with them, to mourn with them, to pledge our commitment to fight for justice for them in memory of their child, Jacqueline Calmaquin, what they told us is, can you help us go to the US? Despite the fact that their child had died in the US under those conditions, they preferred to risk that again because the conditions are so dire where they live. What the data tells us about that region, and the region where Felipe Gomez Alonso was raised, was from, who died on Christmas Eve. Felipe Gomez Alonso died on Christmas Eve, 8 years old, of preventable flu. That's what he had, a high fever, and they never detected it, and they let him die in the hands of Customs and Border Patrol, the Border Patrol in the US. We went to visit his village, we went to visit his family, and what they told us was the same story. They are in the region of western Guatemala that borders Mexico. All of this is the border with Mexico. This is Chiapas. And what they told us is, help us go, help us go. And we asked them about the drought. The drought had been going on for 5 years there. It is impossible to live a sustainable life in those circumstances. According to the Washington Post, I'm not quoting here, some decolonial study or theory. The Washington Post, on its front page a week ago, published an extensive article documenting, through ethnography and interviews, that 70% of the communities in that region that we visited in western Guatemala have acute levels of hunger that are higher than anywhere else in the world today. The highest rate of hunger in the world. We might then ask, why do they migrate? Why do they migrate? So it's not just, quote, poverty, it's hunger. But these communities are also, both here and there, precisely the communities that were targeted for genocide by Guatemala's US-backed military government during the same period as martial law here, The US was backing similar regimes in Latin America that had tremendous affinities with martial law here, with Chiang Kai-shek and his despotism. In the Latin American form, there was John Foster Dulles, of course, who supported all of those regimes, the Dulles brothers. These were the regions that were targeted for genocide under that project, right? So there's a continuing genocide. And so the issue we're looking at is what we're talking about now is migration as a continuing form of structural violence and migration as genocide. So we're talking about migrant genocide. That's the framework. So we'll continue there. So let's look at the map from another perspective. This is what I was alluding to before. I know I should stop soon. But anyway, this is one of the great influences of decolonial thinking in Latin America. Of course, it's the world upside down, or the continent upside down, looking at it from the south. This so happens to be a pattern among indigenous peoples in Latin America, to draw maps from the south. So let's look at the next image. Well, I'm sorry, first. This is indigenous groups on both sides of the border, because the issue is not just indigenous groups that move, that come to the US border, but indigenous groups that have always been at the border on both sides. And it's the border that divided them, right? We didn't cross the border crossed us. No cruzamos la frontera nos cruzó. Next. This is from the Lakota perspective. This is the Lakota Nation in South Dakota and North Dakota. It's where the words Dakota come from, Lakota. One of the most sophisticated indigenous communities in terms of its own thinking and agency around these issues. It's also the poorest single region in the US. If you look at the statistics in the US about poverty, the Lakota Reservation is the poorest region in the US. They look at the map this way. So Mexico's above, et cetera. So it's again from the south. And then let's look at it from the Quechua perspective in South America, another major indigenous group and language. Let's look at the next one. Thank you. This is what's called the continent of Awayala, or Abiyala, also from the south, right? So it's this thinking from the south, way before decolonial methodology and epistemology. This is a phenomenon that's deeply embedded in indigenous culture itself. But decolonial thinking learns from those kinds of sources. Next. The current migrant exodus, I've referred to that a little bit. Juan Gonzalez, in his history in the year 2000 of Latino communities in the US, defines Latino communities in the US as, quote, the harvest of empire. We are here because you are there. Why do people from the countries that come to the US come? Because the US has invaded those countries and continues to intervene in them. Yeah, so there's a colonial and neo-colonial continuity. Let's continue. The root causes. Why don't we look quickly at that Washington Post article? That's the one I mentioned earlier, the first one, just so you can see it. And of course, I'm going to share the links with you. But just the headline is the reason why, somewhere underneath the ads, the reason many Guatemalans are coming, a profound hunger crisis. That's where the data is from the UN World Food Program and FAO about the 70% acute hunger rate in Western Guatemala, in the villages I mentioned. We can go ahead, sorry, to the next link. Go back. What do we see on the ground right now? Well, no, I'm sorry, we can stop that. That's Biden saying don't come. You don't need to see that, we already talked about that. Sorry, we'll go ahead to the next one. Just what I wanted to remind you of, there's a literary source for all of this. If you want to understand what's called the current crisis at the US-Mexico border, what I mean by crisis is too many of us are coming, right? Right? Bottom line, that's really the issue. But the crisis is real in the sense of the conditions in the home countries that force people to come, right? That's a whole other issue. Leslie Marmon Silko, who's a novelist, indigenous Pueblo novelist from Laguna, Pueblo. And if any of you are familiar with her work, Leslie Marmon Silko. I know we have experts here in literary theory, so I'm not even going to try. But all I would say is this. If you read her novel, published in 1991, on the eve of the commemoration of the 500 years, right, 1492, 1992, right, the first encounter, Columbus, etc., she envisioned these, what she described as armies of justice coming of indigenous peoples from the South to recover the land and the resources that had been taken by the North. That was her vision of migration at Mexico's border. I suspect Leslie Marmon Silko had a good instinct about what's going on, so I commend that novel to you. I think novels are almost always better at describing these things. Art is always better, culture is always better than the dryness of our more empirical work. Let's continue. So maybe we can close with this. What is the border? The border is a wall. The border is a bridge. The border is a window. And the border is a mirror. It's a wall. It's what we're up against. It's what divides us. But it's also potentially a bridge. The border is a window. The border is a space that enables us to see things that we would otherwise miss. The border is a mirror. It's a space that reflects who we are. What does it say about us? We look in that mirror. That means the border is literally and metaphorically a prophetic space, like the writing of Leslie Marmon Silko, which is essentially political prophecy. And it means that what we're about, when we talk about applying decolonial thinking and approaches to these questions, we're talking about putting that which is marginal at the center. That's exactly how Stuart Hall defined the concept of diaspora. It's the centering of the peripheral. Yeah? The way he went to London to found cultural studies, no? Et cetera. Or Tendaye Achiume at UCLA Law School. And it means making visible that which is invisible, which of course is Gandhi's great lesson of satyagraha, making suffering visible. So at the end, let's skip all the way to the end, sorry, because we just don't have time to get into all of these details, but you'll have the presentation. What are the key demands? I'm sorry, the previous? Yeah. The key global demands of migrant and indigenous social movements today, which to me is that's where we need to be as human rights advocates, as psychologists, as social workers, as people engaged with these issues within our professional disciplines. What they are seeking to do, migrant and indigenous movements around the world in every language, is they are seeking to redefine hegemonic forms of colonial and neo-colonial citizenship and sovereignty through the affirmation of 4 rights. It's the right to the material conditions necessary for a dignified life. Everything that's referred to in Articles 22 through 28 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that we normally describe in human rights study as economic, social, and cultural rights, ESC rights. The right to self-determination and autonomy, which of course came out of the movement for decolonization, but then was gradually extended, and it took a long time, to the struggles of indigenous peoples as well, right? Then the right to remain, which I mentioned before, the right to remain in your communities of origin, not to be displaced. But the right to migrate, which is triggered, or the right to freedom of movement, where and when structural conditions make a dignified life impossible. Interestingly enough, and this is where I'll conclude, this takes us to the very origins of what's come to be known as international law. What we've been reading with my students is the critique of the colonial origins of international law by Anthony Angie, originally from Sri Lanka, currently based in Singapore, previously at University of Utah. Anthony Angie, his book about the colonial origins of international law, where he argues that one of the great forerunners of international law before Grotius of the Netherlands was Francisco de Vitoria of Spain, of the Salamanca School, the University of Salamanca, one of the most ancient universities in Europe, in the West. And what Francisco de Vitoria said is that the Spanish conquest of the Americas was justified because he understood there to be a right in natural law, which he understood as the right to migrate. the right to freedom of movement. But that meant that there was freedom for Spanish colonial conquerors to come to the Americas and wage the genocide that they did and continue to for 500 years, right? And so what we say is, if you can move, we can move too. And the right cuts both ways. Thank you.